Well, hello again. This is the retiree, the grandfather, and the one struggling to find a piece of memory. We just visited at some length about my high school experience, my friends, and some of the things in the community where I grew up. But actually, as dominant in terms of the time spent as our high school years and our friends were, the real core of values and priorities and influences in our community was the family and the church. And apart from the high school, those were the two primary places where people spent time. Families were a close-knit group. Most of the people in that community were descendants, or most small communities in the Midwest and at least in central Kansas, were descendants of Central Europeans, Germans, and Northern Europeans, where family values were quite predominant. Family life was quite predominant. And not only just because of the values that the people had brought from their ancestry, but I think in a healthy way, the absence of distractive activities made families the center point of activity. Most family members went to every other family member's activity when possible. In the entire 7-8 years that I played competitive basketball, my father only missed one single game. And that was a game when he had a business meeting in Kansas City. My mother, my grandmother, and my sister, to my best of my recollection, went to every single basketball game. And they weren't unusual, because every other student's parents went to all of their activities, even those out of town. And out of town in that part of the country means 30, 40, 50 miles away every Tuesday and Friday night of the winter for a basketball game. So it was a significant commitment. But since there wasn't a whole lot else to do, it was a normal family activity. But of course it was always Tuesday and Friday evening, because Wednesday was church night, and nobody dared infringe on church night. Church night was a less formal service. It was referred to as a Bible study and a prayer meeting. But the preacher never forgot to give a sermon. So we had a very similar church service on Wednesday night as we did on Sunday. But not just Sunday morning. It was Sunday morning for Sunday school at 10, Sunday morning for church service at 11, and back again Sunday evening at 6 for what we referred to as endeavor, kind of like, I guess, an evening Sunday school, and then, of course, an evening church service at 7. So most people were in their pew 5 hours a week, 2 Sunday morning, 2 Sunday evening, 2 Wednesday night, and nothing infringed on those. And if they did, it was an activity that raised eyebrows all across the community for infringing on church time. And although there were 3 churches in that little community, it would be hard to draw the line small enough to differentiate amongst their Christian religion philosophy. All Protestant, all conservative. The most liberal church probably in the community was a very right-wing Methodist church. And the most fundamental conservative religious practices and beliefs were in what's known as the Grace Brethren denomination, where my family attended. And it was a very literally interpreted Bible. It was a very admonishing church service. And it was very fundamentally focused on the principles of religion, which instilled a great deal of consciousness about behavior, values, priorities, almost all of which were grounded in some way to a biblical principle. all of that being very positive, it was quite restrictive to young people. The community took a dim view of dancing of any sort. It took a dim view of card games, because card games were tools of the devil as he and as they were used in gambling. By the same token, there seemed to be no concern about the use of guns, which we all know are frequently and were at that time used by those with the worst intentions in life. But guns were in, cards were out, church was in, dancing was out. And movies coming out of Hollywood with quite less evidence of value and principle than shared by people in that community, of course, were in the shadow of the gray area. Yes, you can go to movies, but, and some movies were off limits. We never figured out which ones were, and by today's standards, they were all G-rated at worst. You can do some editing here, I think, Chris.
Sure, that's fine.
Most families involved the entire family in the work of the family. I can think of almost no families where some members of the family were engaged in one type of work and others another. If the family's income came from running a hardware store or a grocery store, both parents were involved, the children were involved. Most people being farmers, whether they lived in the town or not, everybody in the family was involved in farming, one way or another, either tending the livestock, working in the field, preparing the food, tending the garden. Whatever it was, the family was all involved all the time. And to a great extent, our work sort of dominated our family life and our family activity. And like most other activities that people might think are somewhat boring and restrictive, it never occurred to us that going to the field, doing the work, was anything other than normal. It wasn't onerous. In fact, I often thought when I was in school, the best day of the year is the first Monday after school's out in the spring, because I have a whole 3 months to work on the farm with my dad. Be outside, be in nature, and work with my dad. And as a result of that, I think most people gained and shared and learned to appreciate the values of their parents, because we spent so much time with them, and in my case, with my dad. Sporting activities were a little bit limited because of the extent of work in the summer, but we almost always played softball in one of the county seats, and there were softball teams from around the various towns, and of course always in the evening and late evenings, so that they wouldn't interfere with church on Sunday and with work on every other day of the week, because those things certainly came first. But I remember how, as a young child, I think I was about 12 years old when the laborer that worked for my father became ill, and it was late in the summer and he had no help. And I was playing with my farm toys in the backyard, and he came in and says, "Bob, come on." Every summer, late. I think most of the age, things that we were expected to do as kids. Without that they that waved at us as we drove through town in our vehicle. So we experienced young children are not ready to express on our own. And I think gain a lot of confidence in the whatever that you can solve the problem yourself if you have to. That it's a confidence and self-reliance that was really quite assuring. But then, as the years proceeded and progressed, and it came time to go to college, lots of things came up that raised questions. Well, what are you going to study? And my dad was a very foresightful person. He strongly encouraged me to study a lot of math and a lot of science. Well, I didn't know anything about math and science other than what as a curriculum, but I did enjoy the quantitative and analytical parts of problem solving. I remember how much every kid in school hated geometry, and only 5 of us took it, and I loved it. I remember how the song was we didn't have to put another load of wheat in that bin. And all those things I remember enjoying doing, and it probably influenced my inclination to study things that had applications of quantitative tools, although I didn't know really what those things were at that time when I went to college. So when it came time to go to college, the church influence and my family influence was quite heavily toward some type of experience that would not erode my religious values, and that was one of the biggest concerns that the community had about kids going to college, because that's where the root of all evil began, was when they left home and left the community and went to college. And it was not an unfounded fear for many parents, because untold numbers of young people came back with quite different views of life and practices than those with which they left the community. So our church had a college, a private college in Indiana, that, like the church, was quite fundamental, quite biblical in their teachings, quite rigid in their behavior requirements. And I and 4 other people from that, young people from that community, ended up going to that college. And it being a small college, I had an opportunity to play basketball. That was an appeal. The basketball coach was one of the recruiters, so that had an influence on me. And I went to a small town south of Chicago, to a community called Winona Lake, Indiana, and attended Grace College. Attended for 2 years. And as limited as that experience was in that small community, in that small college, with their own rigid boundaries on behavior, movies were off limits there, as were dating in a car with a young woman. Uh, that was off limits unless you had double dates. And those types of restrictions went on and on and on. I remember my roommate decided he was absolutely going to go see the new movie out about Moses and the Ten Commandments. And he went. He and his brother had a car. They went to the movie, and somehow or other the word got back to the campus that Chuck Henry had gone to see a movie. And sure enough, he had a visit with the dean of students about things that really weren't consistent with the teachings of the school. Nevertheless, I felt like I had a pretty good fundamental first 2 years experience in the general arts, in the sciences. There was an excellent math professor there, and I took several math courses and some language courses, and had a very good diverse experience. But I realized in that environment, in that school, with that curriculum, I was perpetuating the limitations that I experienced in high school, and really needed a different type of degree to do anything I might want to do. And as a result, I transferred to Kansas State University at the end of my second year. I had a lot of new experiences in that little town. I worked for the chef who cooked the meals for all the students and ran a dining room in a hotel, and thought I was making more money than you could ever imagine by waiting tables and get a few dollars of tips every evening. I spent a lot of time in basketball practice and games, and as a result, as I look back, there wasn't a high proportion of time spent studying, probably as needed to get the most out of that curriculum. But as a result of my work on the farm in the summer, and my dad always shared some crops and some livestock with me, and as a result of those hours I worked in that hotel, I decided I could get a car. Then I decided I could afford a really nice car. And then I decided I can afford a brand new car. Now, being from very modest means, in a small rural town, growing up with a family that didn't have a whole lot of extra money, that thought, I think, was a little bit unsettling to my parents. Not the fact that I couldn't afford it, that a new car wasn't a good idea, because nobody bought a used car then. We all bought new cars. If you couldn't buy a new car, you just got along until you could. I never heard of anybody buying a used car in that community. We just drove the old ones until they were too used to be sold. At any rate, in the spring of that year, my dad found for me what he thought would be a good new car back in Kansas, and I could get it when I came home for Easter. Problem was, he said the car was 2 tones of gray, light gray and gunmetal gray, and there was no way I was going to own a gray car. So I immediately set out to look for a car, and the chef, who was a good friend of mine, bought a brand new car from his friend in a little town, and his was a 1958 Ford Fairlane 500 with a hard retractable top, the ultimate in Ford cars. I decided I was going to buy a Ford car from him, so I bought a brand new Fairlane car. We called them hardtops because they had no posts between the front and back window, and it all rolled down. Brand new car, 2-tone, light blue, white, kind of the ultimate dream of any college freshman. Problem was, all of my friends, people at the college, had seen nothing but this poor boy from Kansas working in the dining room to make tips every night And there was a lot of talk about how in the world he could get enough money together to buy this car. Well, the problem is I just couldn't quite get enough together, and I lacked $200, so the old chef had to sign the note for me for $200 until I could make enough the rest of the spring to pay him off. Needless to say, that was kind of probably the highlight of my freshman year, except for the fact that a girlfriend I ran into. And I think she latched on real quick that a kid with a new car probably is going to want to go places, and that's one way to get off that campus and have some fun. So I had a full-time girlfriend for about 2 months, until I found out that her friends became quite concerned, because it turns out this girlfriend had a serious boyfriend who was already graduated from college. And when he found out what was going on, apparently he decided it was time to come get her and take her home, and that was the last time I saw that girlfriend. But I did get to keep the car, and it was an unusual experience for a college freshman from a little town without a lot of money. Drove that car for 5 years, which was a long time at that time. At the end of those 2 years, I and one of my other roommates both left Grace College. And we never dreamed in June of 1958, when we would say goodbye, that he and I would never see each other again for 50 years. But we haven't. And only in the last couple of years did we make contact and learn about what each other had been doing for 50 years. At that point, I made yet another attempt to find my way on the campus of Kansas State University. Was successful in getting an application, getting admitted, and by the fall of '58, I was enrolled in the business school at Kansas State University. And I probably vowed out of fear. Everything was a fearful experience. It was a big campus, a big school. The classes were big. It was really quite a frightful experience. And I remember it took me weeks to get enough courage to go into the student union and eat lunch in the cafeteria, because I wasn't quite sure I knew how to negotiate through the cafeteria line, not spill anything, and sit down. Eat my lunch and find my way out again without embarrassing myself. I thought professors were people that you really couldn't talk to in a big school like that. A misconception that I soon learned was quite erroneous and unfair of those faculty. I knew a few people there from small schools around my community that had gone there to school. It seems to me like they took off a lot better in the social life of the campus than I did, but I was so worried about whether or not I was going to be successful academically that I took a room, a private room, in a house just off campus with an older lady who happened to be an aunt of mine. She was an aunt of Mildred Monroe's that lived right close to the campus, and she was alone and wanted somebody to live with her. Well, I moved in, I had a bedroom, and I spent virtually all of my spare time every evening during the week studying. In the wintertime, she really did want some company, except I had to build the fire, and I could study as long as I built a fire and sat in the living room with her while she knitted. Now that was highlights of my freshman year at Kansas State, because being only an hour and a half from home, and for 2 years being 800 miles away from home, I thought it was a total luxury to be able to go home every weekend, and I had a nice new car to drive. So it was back to school early Monday morning, study all week, go home Friday, work on the farm Saturday, back to school Sunday night or Monday morning. I suppose once in a while I would stay on campus, but that first year I was home most weekends, and finally began meeting some friends and had more and more inclination to stay on campus. But at the end of the semester, I remember My dad came with me. We went to Kansas City and we stopped in at the part of the house where I lived to pick up my mail. And at that point in time, there was no way to get your grades except turn in postcards. And postcards, of course, would come a week or 2 or 3 after the semester was over. All of my postcards were waiting. I picked them all up. Dad said, "Well, how'd you do?" And I said, "Well, I guess all right. I got 3 A's and 2 B's. I thought he was going to fall off the front step of that house." He said, "You're kidding. You're really kidding." He was shocked to no end. I think I would have been shocked had I not known how many hours I spent studying that semester. Well, I had a lot of experiences at Kansas State that helped me make a transition from a simple, sheltered, secure life to one in which I felt more comfortable entering the normal social structure and workforce, and felt more like functioning on my own away from family and church and high school. And most of that happened at Kansas State, but that's probably another story.